Well, thank you for joining today's episode of Near and Rupar. I'm David Near, publisher of The Down Ballot. Joining me, as always, my co-host, Aaron Rupar, publisher of Public Notice. And as we titled this episode, this was Aaron's idea. This week saw the epic GOP butt-whoopin of 2025. There is no other way to describe that election. Well, I could think of some synonyms, but the fact of the matter is there is no silver linings whatsoever here for the GOP. This was a top to bottom massive victory for Democrats, but far, far more than that, this was a huge repudiation of Donald Trump, of MAGA, of the GOP, of their policies, and of their march to authoritarianism. And I am sure that folks saw all of the marquee results. Democrats winning the governor's race in New Jersey, flipping the governor's mansion in Virginia, flipping 13 seats in the Virginia House of Delegates. Big, big wins. Zoran Mamdani winning in New York City. California's new pro-democratic congressional map passing in a landslide in California. But this was not just something that happened at the top of the ticket. We saw huge Democratic victories all over the country, in every corner, at every level of the ballot. Democrats retain their majority on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. They flipped 2 seats in statewide elections for the Georgia Public Service Commission that regulates utilities by massive margins, by around 25 points each. Absolutely nuts for a swing state. We also saw just tons and tons of elections that, frankly, Aaron, even go below the radar of the down ballot, which I'm almost embarrassed to say. But on election night and after, I kept seeing story after story after story. This small county in upstate New York, this town in Connecticut, this borough in Michigan, just places that have long been controlled by Republicans, all of a sudden seeing huge Democratic sweeps in the Democratic areas, seeing Democrats do even better than usual. This just really was coast to coast, top to bottom. And I hope it feels like a shot in the arm to everyone, because I think, as you can tell by how animated I am, this has been an awesome week for democracy.
Well, hey, David, you got to pump the brakes a little bit because Tom Emmer was on Fox today talking about, wasn't there like one local race in Long Island that
Oh,
trended,
God.
right?
Yeah.
I'm regretting that I didn't, actually passed on posting that clip, but he was digging deep. He kind of downplayed the results having a lot of significance for next year, but then to kind of counter the narrative, he brought up this race in Long
Nassau
Island. It was kind of
County,
like,
right.
that was like the one race that
The
seemed
one.
to have some good news for Republicans. But you're right. And even, Marjorie Taylor Greene has been doing the TV rounds, talking about this Georgia Public Utilities Commission, which I wasn't even aware existed before last week. But now, I'm very grateful that it does, because it seems like that's a big harbinger. And I guess my one question to you on that, the Georgia one in particular, because I think that's being held up as an example of, a purplish to even like reddish state where Dems had a good result, because, it's in a way easy to hand wave Virginia and New Jersey, as Republicans have been doing, that they're blue states. Even of course, the current governor of Virginia is Republican. But Georgia, it's harder to dismiss results like that. But obviously the turnout's going to be much lower for a race like that than it will be next year with Ossoff on the ballot, not to mention, all the midterm congressional races too. So, I mean, what do you make of that? Because I can see that. I haven't seen a lot of people kind of making that point, but, it's given that turnout so much lower in these kind of off year, especially for an office that is kind of obscure. Do you think there can be too many conclusions drawn from a race like this, or what's your take on that?
So that's an excellent and completely fair question. And I want to remind folks, before I get into my answer, that if you have questions for us, you just need to be a paid subscriber either to the Down Ballot or Public Notice, or ideally both. And you can drop your questions in the chat box. Alana says, David, you guys really geeked it out on election night. Thanks for all the details. Well, thank you for tuning in. We had an awesome live stream on election night. We really, really burrowed down deep, including into races like the Georgia Public Service Commission. Yes, turnout was low in Georgia compared to, say, a typical midterm election. And part of the reason why is because Georgia never has odd year statewide elections. These were special elections due to long-running legal wrangling. But you got to look at it in a particular way, which is yes, lower turnout definitely helped Democrats here. You also had a mayoral race in Atlanta. It wasn't competitive. The Democratic incumbent, Andre Dickens, won another term very easily. And you didn't have any comparable big ticket races elsewhere in redder parts of the state. That said, these were extraordinarily wide wins. Democrats didn't just win 52-48. It's like 63-37. And Republicans should be a little bit freaked about what that means, because why are Republican voters so tuned out? Why aren't they showing up? Why are Democrats benefiting from heightened turnout? Those are still huge problems for them. And the other thing I want to emphasize, Aaron, is that, yeah, Georgia was lower turnout because those elections were so unusual. And like you said, Public Service Commission, that's not exactly tripping off anyone's tongue. But
Yeah.
in other races, in many of these other races, we saw massive turnout. Zoran Mamdani, for instance, he won 1 million votes. No mayoral candidate in New York has won 1 million votes since 1969. We saw huge turnout in Virginia and New Jersey. And also California. It looks like California's turnout could wind up being greater than the 2022 midterms.
Hmm.
Absolutely, absolutely nuts. And something else I want to emphasize about Proposition 50, this was the constitutional amendment there to put in place the new congressional map. Right now, there's still a lot of votes left to count. But right now, Proposition 50 has a higher share of the vote than any Democratic presidential candidate since FDR. Joe Biden set the high water mark for post 1936 with like 63.3. And right now, Prop 50 is at 63.9. And that's completely amazing to me because you would think, oh, there's going to be some Democrats who don't like gerrymandering. Absolutely not. People are ready to fight. They understand that the rules have completely changed. You have to throw a lot of the old ideas out the window. And what they want, the message that they sent here is that they want an extremely aggressive response to Trump.
Hmm. And I know as someone who follows this extremely closely as you do, I'm curious if there are any results that really pop for you as being somewhat surprising. I mean, you've made clear that the overall breadth and depth of the victory that Democrats had on Tuesday is notable, and I'm inferring that you were a little bit surprised just by that. But anything in particular, any race that really jumps out to you as something that was a surprising result?
In a lot of ways, I'm going to say the New Jersey governor's race because the polls really showed that one a lot closer than it was. In the end, the polling average was about +6 on our good buddy G. Elliott Morris's new site, 50+1. But Real Clear Politics, which is a site you should steer away from, they managed to somehow always make the averages look more Republican favorable. They had Mikey Sherrill winning by an average of 3 points. There were bunches of polls that showed in a 1 point race, and she wound up winning by like 13 points. That
Mhm.
was just a smashing victory, and basically almost the same margin as Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, who also outperformed the polls. So I think that these pollsters were really queuing off of 2024, that many of them took 2024 as the new normal, that the shifts we saw last year, especially among younger voters, Latino voters, other voters of color, they decided that these are going to continue into 2025. And we saw the exact opposite. We saw, in particular, Latino voters, especially in New Jersey, but also in other areas as well, swing hard back against Republicans. And I expected that, but I don't think I expected it to the degree that it actually happened. Some of the biggest swings from 24 to 25 were in these heavily Latino areas. And then another place that I want to highlight as being surprising to me, I was sure that Democrats would gain a few seats in the House of Delegates in Virginia. They had a 51-49 margin heading into election night. They flipped 13 seats, Aaron. That's a
Yeah.
crazy number. And to put that in perspective, not long before the election, we had Delegate Dan Helmer, who runs the campaign arm for House Democrats in Virginia. We had him on the Down Ballot's other podcast, and he told us that Democrats were targeting 14 Republican seats. They won 13 out of 14. That never happens. Your target list is always way bigger than your actual flip list. So that was absolutely bonkers to me. Yeah, it exceeded really my wildest expectations. I think it was a bigger night overall than 2017. Really the biggest night for Democrats I can think of probably since 2006.
And have there been any stirrings this week in Virginia about using this new Democratic trifecta and the majorities to redistrict. I know
Yep.
that was a topic heading into the election bit, but just given the uncertainty of what would happen, it seemed like in Virginia it was a little bit more muted than in other states. But where do you see that heading?
So something super fascinating and also very unexpected happened in Virginia just before the election, which is Virginia is one of these states that has a redistricting commission baked into the state constitution. So even though Democrats now are going to have the trifecta, meaning they have the House, the Senate, and the governor's office starting in January, they can't just redraw the map. They have to amend the Constitution. And in California, we just saw voters amend the Constitution to put in place a new map. But it's easier to do an amendment in California than it is in Virginia. In California, the legislature votes once to put an amendment on the ballot, and then voters get to vote. In Virginia, to put an amendment on the ballot, the legislature has to vote twice. And very importantly, those two votes, in between those two votes, there has to be an election. And so Democrats had to hurry and do the first vote before Tuesday so that they could have a chance to get a new map in place for 2026. And they kept this one deep under wraps. I mean, no one knew about this until just a couple of days before they went ahead with it. So they convened for this special session of the legislature a week before Election Day, quickly passed an amendment that would allow them to put in place a new map. And then they won big time on Tuesday. So for anyone who is suggesting that these victories show that Democrats don't need to respond with gerrymanders of their own to Republican gerrymanders, to the contrary, Democrats said, we want a gerrymander in Virginia. Voters gave them the thumbs up. And now in January, once the legislature reconvenes, the new legislature, they'll be able to pass this amendment again, and then it'll go up for a vote for the public, probably in April, and there'll be a chance for a new map in Virginia, which could, by the way, target 3 or maybe even 4 Republican-held seats. It's very possible, Aaron, that the GOP's pell-mell drive to rig the maps is really going to wind up biting them in the ass, because I don't think they were expecting Democrats to respond this aggressively.
Wow. And, to get a little bit into the substance of some of these campaigns, I'm sure you saw, and the best example I saw of this was Hakeem Jeffries after the election doing the TV rounds and basically saying that for him, one of the big lessons is that affordability is kind of a salient issue across the ideological spectrum. Because when you look at Mamdani in New York or Spanberger or Sherrill, obviously, Sherrill and Spanberger are more moderate, Mamdani a democratic socialist, but to a greater or lesser extent, they all made affordability somewhat front and center. Obviously, it was kind of the signature issue for Mamdani and maybe less so for Spanberger and Sherrill. But is that kind of your takeaway too, as Democrats tried to take lessons from this that they can use next year and beyond that, or I guess maybe specifically next year, who knows beyond, but that, for this particular election cycle coming up for the state of the country right now, that affordability seems to be an issue that Democrats can really make hay on, regardless if you're regarded as being more moderate or more left.
That is an excellent question. Before I answer, I just want to give a shout out to someone I saw pop in, Martin Longman. Martin wrote an incredibly nice piece on his Substack about our election night coverage, saying he's never going to turn on cable news on election night again.
Oh, man.
Because he could watch the nerds at the down ballot and strengthen numbers. So Martin, thank you. That was just really, really lovely. So yeah, it really is amazing. Affordability is the number one issue for Democrats because it's the number one issue for Americans. And like you pointed out, Aaron, it works literally everywhere. You can be a Democratic socialist like Mamdani running in super blue New York City, or you can be a very moderate congresswoman or former congresswoman, in the case of Spanberger and Sherrill, in places like Virginia and New Jersey, running on the exact same issue, because this is a long-running crisis in American politics, and it really has just become super, super acute. And there are so many reasons that life has gotten just so unaffordable for most Americans. And now that Democrats are finally really drilling in on this, like I said, it's going to work everywhere. And uh, it's also okay, though, at the same time, for Democrats to run different types of candidates in different races. And, God, there was such frustrating and annoying, but so predictable kind of beltway pundit, Wednesday morning quarterbacking, saying, which candidates point the way forward for Democrats? Is it Spanberger or is it Mamdani? And the answer is yes. Ruben Gallego, he was campaigning with Spanberger shortly before Election Day. He's the Democratic senator from Arizona who just won last year. And he said, look, Mamdani couldn't win in Arizona, but I couldn't win in New York City. You got to run the right person for the right place. So the answer is all of the above. And I think, Aaron, you've probably seen this better than anyone. Trump going on about affordability this week after the election. And he's really been kind of all over the place because on election night, he had this, bonkers all caps Truth Social post screeching that what cost Republicans was the shutdown and the fact that Trump wasn't on the ballot. And then he had some tweets about affordability. But then I think it was just yesterday, you had the clip of him saying, I don't want to hear about affordability. Prices are going down. I mean, my view, I want your take on this, but my view is that because affordability is an issue that's working so successfully for Democrats, that automatically makes Trump hate it.
Yeah, and actually, just before we went live, I was watching Trump with Orban, who's visiting the White
Oh,
House today,
God.
and he's back into the kind of denial phase of affordability in the sense that he called it a con job. That the affordability issue is a con job because prices are going down, and he cites energy prices, which is a very odd one because energy prices
That's
are
the
not
worst.
going down. I could maybe understand if you wanted to hone in specifically like on gasoline, which I think is actually up this year, but at least it's
Yeah.
been kind of close. Maybe you could find certain areas of the country where it has gone down. But yeah, he kind of went from, and I posted this out on social media or pointed this out on social media after he posted it the other night, where he had one True Social post that it almost seemed like he was kind of mimicking Mamdani, where he used the word affordability, which
Yes.
was jarring because I don't think I'd ever heard him
Ever.
type or use that word. So it stuck out. So it seemed like he kind of dipped his toe into trying to raise the salience of it. But of course, not only does he not have an affordability plan, but it's actually the opposite because his
Right.
economic policies are raising prices with tariffs. So now he's kind of reverted to taking the same sort of approach that he did with COVID, where it's like, it's kind of denying reality. But the problem is that obviously with affordability, everybody encounters this. I mean, we learned this during the Biden administration when inflation became such a terrible issue for Biden. One of the big things, at least that I took away from that is, even with COVID, there were pockets of the country, or maybe if you were really quarantined, where, maybe you didn't know someone right away who had gotten COVID or you hadn't gotten COVID. And so, maybe in your community, it wasn't a big issue because there weren't a lot of sick people. Obviously, that wasn't the case everywhere. But with affordability, with prices, everybody goes to the store. If you
Everybody.
have a car, you're filling up your gas tank. But even if you don't have a car, you're going to buy groceries. You're going out to eat. You're seeing that prices are going up. So that is really he's in a really tough corner on that one because not only is there no plan, but he's making it worse. And then the usual lies, just kind of the blatant lying that he does with issues like this doesn't really pan out because people are going to know that he's lying. So the talking point that's been very humorous to me that he's been using all week is this thing about the Walmart
Walmart. I was going to
Thanksgiving
bring that up.
dinner, which is just amazing because I first saw this earlier in the week where I didn't know that Walmart does this, but they kind of put out like a press release every year where they sell sort of like a all-in-one Thanksgiving meal. There's turkey and it has stuffing and et cetera. And they detail what's in the meal and how much it costs. They even kind of break it down by the various inputs, the ingredients, different parts of it. And so, they put out this press release earlier in the week that got a little bit of pickup where they basically announced it's cheaper this year by 25% than it was last year, which to me right away, I was like, that's odd, because we've been hearing about food prices going up. I didn't really make too much of it, but I saw the press release and was like, that's really strange. And then I saw some people, after the administration, I think Trump maybe, I don't know if he tweeted about it or mentioned it,
Yeah.
pointing out that when you put the side by side of the 2024 press release with 2025, the turkey is smaller. There's fewer ingredients. There's fewer sides included with it. I guess it's like a lower type of it's a lower quality turkey this year as well. So like when people really kind of broke this down, basically you are paying less for less in this case. And so, it kind of, I guess, gave Walmart a PR win in that Trump has been bringing this up all week as like, oh, isn't it so great that Walmart, is proving the liberals wrong, that the prices are really down. And he was bringing this up still today. And then a reporter from NBC actually had the
The
bravery
side by side.
to bring up to him, like, you keep bringing this up. But in fact, when you look at what's going on here, the turkey is smaller and there's fewer sides included. And then, of course, his response was the very pat one of, oh, you're from NBC, fake news. Like, didn't even really engage with the substance on it. So that's the sort of thing I think he's going to have to do to play defense here. Because there's really no way for him to pivot at this point. I mean, tariffs is so central to his whole political project. It's such a cornerstone of his economic policies that I really can't see him backtracking on that. And I think that's really been at the heart of, the mild but noticeable inflation that we've experienced this year. So, yeah, he's really in kind of a tough spot there. And if Democrats coming out of Tuesday weren't already kind of sold on affordability, I think his flailing response should reassure them that that's the way to go.
I don't think it's a PR win for Walmart because they've gotten so exposed for what they did. They swapped in store brands for name brands, and they also got rid of the pecan pie apparently.
Oh,
So
did
like,
they? You
yeah,
know more about this than me.
yeah, like I've been a little bit obsessed with it, but it's again one of the like you were saying, it's who do you believe, me or your own lying eyes?
Yeah,
If you are going to Walmart for the Thanksgiving meal and it's something that you do every year, you're gonna notice that
yeah,
there's less food involved. So this feels like Walmart was trying to be tricky here by claiming 25% lower. And no one buys that crap from big corporations. Deborah has a good question tied into this. She asks, is Trump being shown incorrect info about prices by his staff, or is he straight up lying? And I think it's Abe Simpson who said a little of column A, a little of column B.
yeah,
They're objective, truthful information. Not only do we know that that doesn't get through to Trump, but we also know that almost certainly know that he has been shown AI videos of riots and Portland burning down, et cetera, that Stephen Miller is probably making for him, stuff that's just completely fanciful and made up. And so he's shown garbage, and then also his only instinct is to lie. But
yeah.
yeah, I think he's in an extremely bad place because at least the Biden response on inflation wasn't great, but I think they had like almost no good options. And Trump
Right.
is taking an even worse option, which is to lie about it.
Yeah, and I'll defend the Biden record a little bit on this, just in that when we were coming out of COVID, obviously unemployment was at what, like 6 or 7%. So pumping money into the economy to get the job market going in and stimulate activity, I mean, you could make a case that some inflation with a dose of basically full employment and rising wages, like, yeah, it sucked for a year. But by the time, 2023, 2024 came around, I thought the economy was in pretty good shape. And, that's not really like an opinion. I mean, it was in pretty good shape. Certainly not for everyone, but, so yeah. But with Trump, yeah, it's much more, it's very self-created. This isn't like an
Yep.
external shock like COVID
Yep.
was. I mean, this is a product of his own policies. And I think, you're right that one of the differences between the first Trump term and this one is that I think he's much more siloed. Um,
Mm.
I can't speak to his information diet particularly, but when you look at the stuff that he's reposting, there's been no engagement really at all from him with mainstream press. I mean, he did do a 60 Minutes interview, last weekend or the weekend before, but of course we know the direction that CBS has been headed in. So, and even his advisors, of course, tell him what he wants to hear much more so than in his first term, where at least he had some that would kind of tell him inconvenient truths because they thought it'd be politically beneficial for him. So yeah, I mean, it's bad all the way around. And then, you look at his approval numbers. I think CNN had a poll this week that had him at like 37%, 37.63. So, like 26 points underwater. And then, today there were images of him sleeping through the Oval Office event
I saw you
yesterday,
post
where
those.
someone,
Yeah.
yeah, where it's like, it's just kind of mounting. And obviously, a lot can change over the next year. So this is no, we shouldn't spike the football or get complacent at this point. But that was kind of the secret sauce of Trump. The first Trump term was that the economy was always, until COVID, pretty strong. And, people they were willing to tune out a lot of the nonsense as long as they felt good about their economic well-being and how their families were doing. And now that that isn't really the case, you see that he doesn't really have much to rely on. So he's kind of left with like his hardcore base, but all the voters in the middle, including, and you could probably speak to this better than I can, but, it seems like one of the big narratives coming out of the election on Tuesday is that Latino men, which were very key to his victory last year, he's pretty much lost all of the gains that he made last year with Latino men. So, there's a lot of obvious reasons for that. We can pull up social media and see videos of what ICE is doing and what CBP is doing in places, especially like Chicago recently. But, if that holds, it seems like kind of the coalition that he put together last year that drove his victory and a lot of Republican gains has already fractured.
I think you're spot on. Elemental asks a great question here, which is, could 2026 be a Democratic version of 2010? And 2010, of course, was the first midterm of Obama's first term, and Democrats got their asses handed to them. And it was a catastrophic election in so many ways, particularly because it happened right before a redistricting cycle, and Republicans wound up taking control in all these state houses and putting in place all these gerrymanders, and it had all these massive knock-on effects that we're still feeling today. I think 2010 is a possible model, but I might also look to 2006, which was an extraordinary Democratic midterm, the most extraordinary Democratic midterm since I've been following down ballot elections. And I think that people talk about the 6-year itch, which is, if in a president's second term, that second midterm can really be the deadly one. And obviously, we've had this non-consecutive Trump situation, but this, of course, feels like Trump's second term because it is, and he's making it all the more so. So I think that it's very possible that we see a 2006 like wave next year. As you say, Aaron, we don't know. It's impossible to know, and you can't get complacent. But I want to circle back to something you were, kind of laughing about this before. Tom Emmer, Republican congressman from Minnesota, top GOP leader, uh, talking about Nassau County, which did suck for Democrats. I mean, no question about that. But that you have to weigh that against 999 other races that were amazing for Democrats. And this Republican talking point, blue cities and blue states went blue. I mean, okay, keep believing that. I mean, if Republicans want to believe that, that is the best case scenario for Democrats because it means that Republicans are whistling past the graveyard. They're blithely ignoring their own problems. And we saw huge Democratic turnout in all kinds of places, not just the blue cities and blue states. And we also saw voters switching sides, like you were just talking about, this shift among Latino men, many of whom voted for Trump last year, now staying home or coming out to vote for Democrats. And so if Republicans want to pretend like this isn't happening, like, yeah, sure, New York City voted for the socialist. Okay, that's great. Then they're going to get caught sleeping. And the other thing that I want to circle back to, because we talked about it last week, and you shared a clip of this on social media about the anti-trans attacks, because Republicans went super hard on these, particularly in Virginia in the governor's race, when some Earl Sears ran pretty much nothing but anti-trans attacks, and it went super, super poorly for them, and they've got nothing else. They've got nothing else. And so if they're going to keep doubling and tripling down on the same crap that's not working for them, then they really could get their asses handed to them.
Yeah, I want to kind of surface this question that Alyssa asked. I think this is a good one. You mentioned with New Jersey that there may have been a bit of a polling miss there, or at least the polls didn't really capture the support for Cheryl. And Alyssa asked, do you think these results will make next year's polls more accurate or even less accurate? And the reason, so you can maybe, because I'm not entirely sure in this, and I'm sure you're more immersed in this stuff than I am. But with polling, it's not just that you go ask people who they support, but you have to build a model of what you think the electorate is going to look like, and that model is informed by recent elections. So the fact that there was kind of, at least in New Jersey, and maybe you kind of have to. It wasn't like a miss across different states. It seems like it was kind of contained specifically to New Jersey. And I'm not sure if there's a great explanation for that or not. But how do you anticipate kind of pollsters grappling with that? Do you think that will lead to them coming up with models that are a little more favorable for Dems, which could, people talk about the generic ballot all the time. And if it gets to a certain point, if it's like a D+5 generic ballot, then you're looking at kind of like a wave election in the House. Then all bets are kind of off. You brought up 2010 for Republicans or '06 for Democrats as being, previous wave elections. So, I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, does the fact that it was just one state and not kind of more national maybe mean that there's less adjustments to be made, or how do pollsters grapple with that?
I would say it wasn't just New Jersey, because Virginia, like I said, also understated Spanberger by a number of points, and also the California ballot measure, Prop 50. That beat expectations, even the highest polling that it had. It's still well outperforming that. So, the thing is, there wasn't a ton of public polling of many of these races this year. because you just don't tend to see, you're not going to see a lot of public polling of the Bucks County, commissioners races. This is a swingy county outside of Philadelphia, but to the extent that we did see polls this year, they did understate Democratic support. This is always a massive problem for pollsters. Like you said, you can't just call voters up and call 1,000 voters and say, okay, this is what people think. When you call folks for polls, or these days send them text messages, you're going to wind up with a raw sample that doesn't look anything like the electorate that you expect. You're going to get a lot of older folks. You're going to get more women than show up in the electorate. So these pollsters have to make these adjustments. They have to weight their sample, is the term, to make it resemble what they think the electorate is going to look like. And knowing what the electorate is going to look like is always a guessing game. And pollsters are often fighting the last war. And so something happens in an election, they miss, and then they try to overcorrect to, fix the problem of the last election, but the next election poses a different sort of problem. And there's another issue here as well, which is if you miss narrowly but predict the wrong winner, then everyone gives you hell. So if you say Democrat is going to win 52-48 and Republican wins 52-48, that's a relatively small miss. But people will just flay you for that. If you say the Democrat's going to win by 8 and they win by 15, people pay less attention to that. But it's the same size of miss. So I think that smart pollsters are going to try to take some lessons from this. Many won't. But also, I would not look at polls next year and say, oh, well, we should automatically add several points to the Democratic margin because pollsters are undercounting Democrats. We have no idea. So polls are one of these things you just have to take with a grain of salt. Never base your opinion on a single poll, but even when you aggregate all the polls together, they can still miss. So people have mentioned in comments, I mentioned him earlier, follow G. Elliott Morris on Strength in Numbers, because he's going to give you the straight dope on the ways that pollsters are missing.
Yeah, were there any other trends from this election beyond the Hispanic men, kind of trending back towards Democrats? I've seen a lot of commentary about that. I believe in New York, correct me if I'm wrong here, but women for Mamdani was like overwhelming, right? Didn't he won like some crazy percentage of women voters? Maybe that's like kind of a unique thing, but I do kind of wonder if like we've waited for this forever with Trump and Republicans, because obviously they're so misogynistic and like the policies are so bad for women. Like we've waited for kind of this tidal wave of women voters breaking against them. I don't know if that is kind of like New York. Obviously, the New York electorate is kind of its own thing. I don't know if you can really extrapolate from that, but anything beyond kind of the Hispanic men, I'm curious if there are other trends that have emerged.
Yeah, so looking at things, for instance, like shifts in Latino turnout, there are relatively straightforward ways you can do that, such as you look for towns or counties or precincts that to have heavily Latino populations. For things, for instance, like age, demographics by age, you can't really look at a map. It's not like to a certain extent, maybe in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, the average age is a little bit younger than, on the Upper West Side. But you can't really look at a map and see how younger voters have moved. You have to look at things like exit polls, which have the same flaws that any other poll has. And we saw younger voters shift hard back in the direction of Democrats. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. But we have to wait a little while for the more sophisticated analyses to come out. The real hardcore data analysts, they will look at what's known as the voter file. These are records of voters, which they know who's registered where, but also with demographic information attached to them to try to get a sense of how these shifts happen. But really, Democrats made improvements with many, many major groups. It was very, very widespread. And like I said earlier, also, to some extent, we're seeing some Republican voters switch sides. And that's always, a scary thing for, if that's happening to your party, that's a scary thing for you electorally. But yeah, be careful of all the hot takes. Like I said, the big data nerd firms, they will have more sophisticated analyses in a few weeks, a few months. We'll be talking about those. But yeah, this was a very broad-based move against the GOP.
This is a good question here from Wendy, who asked, she points out she missed the first half hour, and she says, did we talk about how the Latino shift might impact the Texas elections? Now, the reason
question.
I've seen some people point out, and again, this is your bread and butter, but that the map that Republicans are pushing for the elections next year, some of the new seats, they're kind of assuming that some of the Latino shift that occurred last year that helped Trump will hold. And if that doesn't happen, then some of these kind of these new seats that are kind of lean Republican may actually be more like toss-ups. So yeah, what's your read on that?
It's a very astute question, and I think is spot on. Republicans targeted 5 seats with this Texas map, and 2 of them are in South Texas, held by some very centrist Democrats. And those were the 2 seats actually that they made the least amount of changes to. They definitely moved them further to the right, not super dramatically, definitely harder. But if they are counting on flipping those seats, they are counting on those Latino trends staying the way they are or continuing, but they're reversing. And so, yeah, I think that you'll hear Republicans targeting 5 seats in Texas, and that's true. But just because they're targeting 5 seats doesn't mean they're going to flip 5 seats. And so, those 2 South Texas seats in particular, I think there is a real chance that, in fact, I'm not. I'd say Democrats might even still be favored to hold those.
Mm,
And then there's a third district. It's a little bit difficult to describe where it is. That this was Greg Casar's old seat, and he's running in a different district now.
yeah.
This is the 35th district. That also depends a lot on the Latino shift, and maybe Democrats could wind up holding it. By contrast, in California, I think Democrats are favored to flip at least 4 of the seats that they targeted, maybe all 5. So yeah, Republicans, it's not going to bite them in the ass. I don't think that they like jeopardize any of their incumbents. I don't think any of the already GOP seats are going to be more in play now because of the new gerrymander. But yeah, they just can't count on Latinos.
What's your sense of, given Trump's unpopularity, which seems to be kind of at like a high crest right now? Again, there was a CNN poll that looked absolutely brutal for him. In a normal political environment, you could see Republican candidates next year kind of looking at that and wanting to distance a little bit, that they don't want to be associated with like kind of a toxic brand. Obviously, we're sort of in an unprecedented situation in American politics, where one party is kind of a cult. So I don't really see how that could possibly work. Do you have any thoughts on like how that might play out? I mean, do you think there could be a viable path for some Republicans to try to? I mean, we're seeing this. I guess with Marjorie Taylor Greene is kind of a great example right now, where I don't really know what her deal is. I mean, I guess I'm kind of persuaded by this idea that she might try to run for president in 2028. Just given that she's doing the media rounds, kind of really talking bad about Mike Johnson, but even with Trump, saying that he's not being America first, that he's spending too much time abroad and meeting with foreign leaders, he's not focused on affordability. Do you think that's a viable path, or is it maybe she's a unique case because she already has this kind of national celebrity, and so she can get away with more?
Yeah, I think you're right about MTG in particular. In a normal election year, when it's a midterm and the party in the White House is polling very poorly, you do typically see candidates further down the ballot try to distance themselves from the unpopular president. And it can work a little bit on the margins, but it's never a savior. I mean, plenty of Democrats tried in 2010, which we were talking about earlier. Democrats, of course, still got their asses kicked. And they tried again in 2014, and they still got their asses handed to them. And to a certain extent, you saw it a bit in 2018 with some Republicans, but Republicans again got whooped. And so now, with the GOP essentially being a death cult, how do you distance yourself from Trump at all? Uh, uh, you know, you're always at risk of him just absolutely shitting on you. If you face a primary, then there's no way you can. And this also certainly, I think, hurt Jack Ciattarelli in New Jersey. He had a primary. He wanted going away, but he had Trump's endorsement. He leaned into that, and that made it very, very easy for Mikey Sherrill to hammer him for his ties with Trump. And all these pundits were like, "Oh, no one cares about that." Yeah, well, apparently New Jersey voters did.
Mm.
So I think that Republicans are even more stuck with their president than like Democrats in 2010 were with Obama. But I think it's a good point. Could that cause them to have an even worse midterm than normal because they can't get any daylight, any separation? Maybe.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I recall even in 2022 when Biden's numbers were not very good at the time, he kind of sat that out largely, right? Like I don't recall seeing him doing a lot of events
No.
on the trail, which, part of that was, I remember there being a lot of chatter at that time about like, Dems not necessarily wanting to appear with them. And then, because the midterms went relatively well, that sort of changed. I think that gave an impetus to him running again. But yeah, I mean, I just bring that up because it's another example of like, his numbers were bad. I don't think they're as bad as Trump's are right now. But even then, there was a sense of like, I'm just going to campaign on my own. Maybe have, if you have the sway, I remember Obama kind of hitting the trail for some candidates in those final weeks, but not so much Biden. And Trump, notably, I think we touched on this a little bit last week, but he wasn't out there doing rallies for any of these candidates, which I think kind of gave him some plausible deniability. I mean, he's already kind of thrown Sears under the bus in
Right, right,
comments this
right.
week. And then again, a comment about Citarelli that, I endorsed him, but only kind of barely, that he like posted something on social media, and that was kind of it. So, maybe that is part of his political instincts, that he could kind of sense that it wasn't going well and didn't want to tarnish his own brand in that way. But it's going to be harder for him to pull it off in the midterms. I think there'll be an expectation that he gets out there a little bit more, and that may not help. It may be in the
It
primaries
won't.
it will, but not in a general.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Where this is, we're doing one of those things that like we have to do, but I hate to do, which is like getting in the mind of Donald Trump. Does he want to just go and play golf, in Florida next fall, November 2026, or does he actually insist on being the face of the GOP and getting out there and demanding candidates campaign with him, or does he decide that he does want that, but he goes in campaigns for the Republican, governor candidate in Alabama?
Yeah.
Races where he can't really do much harm. Who the hell knows? There's no good options. If he winds up sitting it out, I guess that's probably the best case scenario for the GOP. But also, Trump dominates our consciousness in a way that no other president ever has in our lifetimes, and hopefully never will again. And so, I think Trump is just going to be omnipresent in 2026, because he's omnipresent in our lives.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that it was notable to me this week that Trump really started going wild on the filibuster talking point
Yeah.
after the election. I mean, it's been like a daily thing, multiple times a day, and I do think there's something in his mind happening where he thinks that if they nuke the filibuster, then he can basically pass some sort of draconian voting act that will ban mail voting and have voter ID, and so I think these things are related. Where he saw the results on Tuesday, and now he thinks that they really have to redouble efforts to basically kind of rig elections going forward. I've thought a little bit. I don't really have a sense on this yet because the chatter has been around the filibuster. If Republicans do go that route, which I don't think is like totally far fetched at this point, then would there be an appetite for like super draconian, like a national voter ID, or would that even be, would it withstand scrutiny from the courts? Like, I don't have a great sense of that, but you can see the gears turning that he thinks this is a way that they can kind of limit the damage next year.
I mean, maybe I think that the odds of the filibuster getting nuked or even curtailed are extremely low, because John Thune and Senate Republicans, they know that the filibuster is something that really only harms Democrats and doesn't harm Republicans. I do think, Trump going on about the filibuster is the best possible thing to happen for Democrats regarding the shutdown, because it completely changes the narrative about who is responsible here. I mean, the Beltway, insider rags are, still somehow pinning this on Democrats. But, when Trump's out there every day saying Republicans can end the shutdown, boy, that just becomes harder and harder to stand against. I don't know. I would be pretty surprised if Republicans do pass some really draconian anti-voting bill. And that also brings me to a point that I think may be a good one to wrap on, which is, we've been talking about these elections like any other elections. And I think that that is really important to hold on to in your heart, because for all the justifiable fear that people have had ever since the moment that Trump won again last year, is, will we have free and fair elections? And the answer is, we pretty much still do. Yes, there are many, many ways that Republicans try to suppress the vote. There are many people who want to be able to vote who can't, for instance, who have, had past felony convictions and served their time and never got the right to vote back. There's still all kinds of impediments. There are places that, still don't have early voting or make it really hard to vote absentee. But the fact of the matter is, we saw this massive turnout. And these elections happened really without interference, and the winners won. And what we haven't really seen, I don't think, Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, but we haven't seen Trump scream that they were, rigged or stolen or, like 2020. And so, yeah, we have to remain vigilant. Anyone who cares about democracy has to remain extremely vigilant because it could get worse at any time, and it probably will. But uh, it also shows you just how limited Trump's power is to actually undermine our elections. And yeah, I think things will to some degree be worse in 2026. And there's always a black swan possibility that he does something just absolutely outrageous that I don't even want to contemplate, that really fucks with our elections. But on Tuesday night, our democracy functioned the way it's supposed to function. And please, when things are feeling down, when you're feeling depressed, when the Trump news is just absolutely terrible, remember that the party that wasn't in power was able to win power in an election, and that happened on Tuesday, and it can happen again next year.
Yeah, that's a really great point to wrap it on. Marlis points out that all of the Republicans who lost conceded, which is also kind
Yep.
of notable that none of the individual candidates were decrying any sort of
Yep.
alleged fraud. And then I pointed out the day after on Wednesday, Youngkin held a news conference where these weren't comments that should have been notable really at all, but he gave
Right.
this news conference where he basically said like, I wish the governor elect all the best, and she ran a great campaign, and it was like, what is this? I'm so conditioned now to, I mean, like some of the things that Trump has said about Nancy Pelosi, which we didn't even have time to get into today, but, kind of sliming people and defaming them. And there was very little of that. So, yeah, I mean, it
Yeah.
kind of felt like for a minute there, that normal politics prevailed. And I think that's part of the reason that, at least for me, this is probably the most hope I've had at least since the 2022 midterms, if not even going back maybe the 2020 election, honestly, where it feels like the tide has kind of shifted a bit. So on that note, let me do a final plug here for David's fantastic work at
Thank
the
you.
Down Ballot. I regret that I did not watch your live broadcast on Tuesday, although I kind of don't, because I live tweeted the Mamdani speech later in the night, which was big business for me in terms
Oh,
of
that was great. That was
yeah,
great.
yeah. And so, there was a lot of just throughout the night of kind of the canon interviews and whatnot. But file that away for next time, because if people are saying that it's better than watching cable, that's pretty
Oh
high
yeah.
praise, because election night's kind of the best night for cable news, probably. But if you want, more analysis along the lines of what we've been doing today, the Down Ballot is a great place to, to support, to get all of that. And likewise, if you like kind of the bigger picture conversation about what's up with Trump, or we actually have a Q&A coming tomorrow with Don Moynihan on his
Oh,
piece about
nice.
the purge and surge, merge, purge, and surge, I think is how he puts it, kind of the three-part authoritarian plan that Trump is trying to implement, that Don has written about in his own Substack. But, we'll see. I mean, the election on Tuesday maybe will put a wrench into that a little bit, as Trump's political support seems to be cratering. But we will be back not next week because, David is traveling next week, but we will be back for a pre-Thanksgiving episode the following week, and then off for Thanksgiving week. But we'll see you here, same time, same place, 2 weeks from now.
Bye, everybody.